Welcome back to Applied Wisdom, Literature for Living Better. And I think a lot of you are already on this path trying to understand yourself and the world better. And so today we're going to dive into a book called Fooled by Randomness by this guy, Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Yeah, Taleb.
Have you heard of this guy?
Oh, yeah. He's a little bit of a character, but really insightful. And I think this book in particular, Fooled by Randomness, it's a really great starting point for kind of looking at the world through this lens of like how much randomness actually affects our lives.
I think what really drew me to this book was just how often we try to come up with these tidy explanations for why things happen, right? Especially when it comes to success or failure.
Right.
And this book kind of pulls back the curtain a little bit and says, like, hold on a second, like you might not have as much control as you think you do.
There's a good dose of humility, I think, that comes with reading Taleb and really understanding just how much of life is actually shaped by things that we just can't predict or control.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of those things. One of the first big ideas that jumped out at me was this concept of survivorship bias.
Right.
And I think it's so easy to fall into this trap, right? Like we're constantly looking at the winners in any field, whether it's business or sports. We see the people who are at the top of their game and we're like,
right.
Okay, what's their secret? What can I learn from them?
That's the formula,
yeah.
Right? And we try to reverse engineer it, and that's natural.
Totally, but I think what Taleb is saying is like, be careful because what you're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like we're looking at this beautiful skyline of skyscrapers, but we don't see the foundation and all the things that it took to actually build those skyscrapers.
Right. It's like the unseen cemetery of all the businesses that tried to do the same thing and just,
right.
Didn't make it.
Totally. And it's like for every 10x your business in a year story that you see out there, there's probably 99 other businesses that try to do the same thing and completely failed.
Right.
So it's not just about, copying what the visible successes did, but it's about understanding what were the factors that actually allowed them to survive when so many others didn't.
So for our listeners, next time you're reading one of those amazing success stories,
right.
I think a helpful question to ask is, what about all the other people or businesses that tried this?
Right.
And, maybe didn't succeed? Like, what did they do and how is that different?
What can we learn from the failures as much as we learn from the successes? Because there's a lot of information there.
Absolutely. And I think building on that idea of how our perception can be skewed,
yeah.
Taleb also talks about this concept of skewness and fat tails.
Right.
Yeah. Can you kind of break down, like, what does that actually mean? Because I think it can sound a little bit jargony.
Yeah, for sure. So think about like a bell curve. The classic examples, like people's heights.
Right.
Most people are going to be clustered around the average height, with very few people who are super tall or super short. And that's kind of like a thin tail distribution.
Okay.
But when you look at things like wealth, for example, the distribution looks very different. You still have most people clustered around a certain range, but then you have this tiny number of individuals who have like astronomical wealth.
Right.
And that creates this fat tail where these extreme events, whether positive or negative, have a disproportionate impact on the overall picture.
So it's not enough to just look at averages.
Yeah.
We need to consider these really rare but really significant events.
Exactly. And so for you listening, it might be helpful to think about like, what are the potential fat tail events in your field or in your own life?
Okay.
Like, what are those things that are unlikely to happen, but if they did, would have a huge impact?
Like a black swan event?
Exactly. And importantly, like, what kind of safeguards can you put in place? What kind of robustness can you build into your life or your work to kind of weather those storms?
I love that word, robustness. It makes me think about like building a house that can withstand a hurricane.
Exactly.
Rather than just hoping that the hurricane won't come.
Exactly. And I think that's a really key takeaway from Taleb's work is that we can't just focus on the most likely scenario we have to think about the extremes as well.
Absolutely. No, another concept that really resonated with me was this idea of how we make sense of the past.
Yeah.
And Taleb talks about hindsight bias and the narrative fallacy, and I think we've all been there, right?
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, hindsight bias is that thing where, something happens and you're like, oh yeah, I kind of knew that was going to happen all along.
Right.
Even though at the time you were completely blindsided by it.
Totally. It's like our brains are just like rewriting the story.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to make the past seem more predictable than it actually was.
Yeah.
And then the narrative fallacy is that, we love a good story, right? We want to connect the dots. We want to have a clear cause and effect.
I think our brains are just wired for that.
Totally. But the problem is that those stories that we tell ourselves can sometimes obscure the role of randomness.
Right.
We connect dots that weren't necessarily connected at the time, and we convince ourselves that the past was more orderly than it actually was.
Yeah, like I remember after that unexpected company merger a few years ago,
Yeah.
like I convinced myself that I had a gut feeling all along that it was going to happen.
Right.
But in reality, I was just as surprised as everyone else.
Totally. That's like our brains are constantly trying to create this like coherent movie of our lives, even if the reality was a little bit more messy and chaotic.
Right.
Yeah.
So what can we do about that? How can we kind of combat that tendency to rewrite the past?
Well, I think whenever you're looking back on events, whether they were successes or failures,
Right.
it's helpful to kind of challenge your own explanations.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, like, could this have turned out completely differently even if I had made the exact same decisions?
Right.
And be wary of those stories that feel too perfect.
Right.
Because they often mask the influence of champs.
Yeah, like life is not always a Hollywood movie.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so speaking of how we make sense of the past, Taleb also talks about this concept of the problem of induction.
Yeah.
And it sounds very academic, but it has a really simple illustration, right?
It does. It's basically the idea that just because something has happened repeatedly in the past
Right.
doesn't guarantee that it's going to continue to happen in the future.
Okay.
And the classic example that he uses is the Thanksgiving turkey.
Okay, I've heard about this one.
So every single day of this turkey's life, the farmer comes out and feeds it.
Right.
So the turkey has all this evidence to suggest that the farmer is benevolent and things are good.
Right.
And then Thanksgiving comes.
Right, poor turkey.
Right. And it's a little bit grim.
Yeah.
But it's a good reminder that just because we've seen a certain pattern in the past doesn't mean that that pattern is going to continue forever.
So it's not to say that we shouldn't learn from the past,
Right.
but we should just be careful about assuming that those patterns are like unbreakable laws.
Exactly. Especially in environments that are complex and unpredictable, which
Yeah.
describes a lot of our lives.
Totally. Now, one of the areas where this whole randomness versus skill debate gets really interesting is when we look at success.
Yeah.
And Taleb argues that it's often really hard to tell how much of someone's success is due to their skill and how much is just plain luck.
It's so hard to disentangle the two, especially in the short term.
Right.
Someone might have this like spectacular run of success, and it's natural to attribute it all to their genius.
Right.
But being in the right place at the right time,
Yeah.
having those tailwinds that we talked about
Right.
can play a huge role.
Right. And conversely, someone could be incredibly skilled, but just experience a string of bad luck.
Absolutely. And it doesn't mean that they're not talented or capable.
Right. So how do we navigate that? Like, how do we kind of assess, whether something was due to skill or luck?
Well, I think one of the things that Taleb emphasizes is focusing on the process rather than just the outcome.
Okay.
So evaluate your decisions based on how sound they were at the time you made them,
Right.
based on the information that you had, rather than just judging them by whether they happen to work out.
Okay.
So were you making logical, well-reasoned choices, even if they didn't lead to immediate success?
Right.
Because in the long run, a good process is much more likely to lead to good outcomes than just, relying on lucky breaks.
That's like that saying, trust the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important mindset shift, especially when we're dealing with so much uncertainty.
Absolutely. Now, finally, Taleb touches on how we react emotionally to all this randomness.
Right.
And let's be honest, we're not always the most rational beings when it comes to gains and losses.
No, not at all. Our emotions are wired to react very strongly and often disproportionately
Right.
to both positive and negative surprises.
Like that feeling when you make a big win on an investment and you're like, oh, I'm a genius.
Exactly.
And then the next day you lose it all and you're like, oh, I'm an idiot.
Yeah. Or the pain of a loss can often feel so much more intense
Yes.
than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
Yes.
And that can lead us to make some really irrational decisions.
Yeah, like panic selling or, chasing those risky quick wins to try to make up for a loss.
Exactly.
So how do we kind of like manage our emotions
Right.
in the face of all this uncertainty?
Well, I think one of the keys is to try to cultivate a little bit of detachment from those short-term fluctuations.
Right.
So, don't get too caught up in the daily noise.
Right.
Focus on your long-term strategy
Yeah.
and avoid making decisions based on those fleeting emotions.
So it's almost like taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah. So if our listeners are taking away one or two things from this deep dive into fooled by randomness that they can start applying today, what would those be?
I think the first one would be to cultivate that intellectual humility.
Yeah.
Recognize the limits of your own knowledge and predictions.
Right.
Be open to the idea that sometimes things happen just due to chance.
Okay.
And the second thing would be to focus on building robust systems in your work.
Okay.
Think about managing risks and preparing for those unexpected events.
Rather than just chasing those random spikes of success.
Exactly.
Yeah. Fooled by randomness. It really does give you a different lens through which to see the world.
It does.
And I think by understanding the power of chance, we can hopefully become a bit more thoughtful about our own successes and failures and maybe a little less surprised by the unexpected.
Absolutely. It's about embracing that uncertainty and focusing on what you can control.
Yes.
Your processes, your mindset, and your ability to adapt.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Fooled by Randomness on Applied Wisdom, Literature for Living Better.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found these insights valuable, and stay tuned for the next one.
And if this helped you, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel.
It really does. We'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye.